Hello everyone, welcome to July inside the Nature Creative. I am so excited for this month's topic of gardens, and that is a very large term, I know. It's hard to narrow down, but the first thing I want us to think about is really the difference between wild and untended flowers and those that are cultivated, meaning they need a human to help them grow or to help them grow in a certain area. A lot of times in the creative, we are focused on wildflowers, wild plants, wild habitats, places that are not regularly tended by human beings. But this month, we're going to focus on those places that are regularly tended by humans, plants that are cultivated, plants that are grown in specific places, specific ways. I hope it's going to be a lot of fun and kind of an interesting twist on our normal studies. There are so many questions that come to my mind when I think about these two different things, the wildflowers and the cultivated flowers and plants. And of course, some of them are, which one do I prefer? Do I have a preference for one over the other? Is there something that draws me to the wild or to the cultivated? And kind of what are those characteristics? Are there certain kinds of gardens that I'm drawn to? Maybe just a green plant type of place? Or am I really drawn to rose gardens or vegetable gardens or gardens in front of a home or in pots? There's so many things to think about, not to mention different styles of gardens that connect with cultures. And then I think there's that all-important question of how do I feel in a garden, in certain garden settings? I asked my 18-year-old son today what comes to his mind when I say the word garden. He immediately said British grass, which of course is something he would say, and that is what those in Great Britain call their yards. The land that is around their houses, whether or not it's cultivated or not, they refer to it as a garden. So the lawn, the gardens, the shrubs, the trees are all lumped into this sum of garden, which is really kind of nice when you think about it. Well, I prompted him, okay, what else beyond that? And he said flowers. He included bugs. And then I said, what kind of a garden are you drawn towards? And he said, well, fairy gardens. And I said, fairy gardens? You mean tiny little fairy gardens? No, big fairy gardens, sort of. And I think what he was trying to get at is a garden space for an adult that is just as magical as a little fairy garden miniature is to a child. And that kind of captures a little bit of what gardens are supposed to be, I think. A kind of entrance into a magical and beautiful world. I think it's a portal for our imaginations, which need to be refreshed after working with the everyday world most of our days. Anyway, I thought that was really interesting what he said. And then he said he definitely wanted the garden to be kind of hidden, sort of things overhead. He wanted a feeling of a room, and he didn't want to be able to see anything beyond the garden. So really it was a kind of escape. So that was really interesting. I enjoyed that exercise, and it helped me get to know my son just a little bit more. I did ask him, I said, so are you going to have a garden when you grow up? Oh, yes, of course, he was going to. I said, are you going to do the gardening? And he said, well, if I have to. So we'll see what that means. But I do think that, at least for me, there is that sense of I have to have a garden, therefore I will do the work if that's necessary. Anyway, think about it this week. Use gardens as a conversation starter when you're with other people. Find out what it is that they think of when they hear the word garden or what they are drawn to in gardens. And I'm sure it'll just help expand your thinking on this topic. Don't forget to jot it down in your journal. I want our study of gardens to have a sort of vacation feel about it this month. And if you are going on vacation, it's the perfect time to notice the gardens around you, the plantings, where you might be staying. Maybe you're going to take a walk in a different town or city. You can observe the houses there, the parks. Maybe you're going somewhere where you could actually schedule to go and visit a large garden, maybe at a historic home or a special park. Think about that and plan ahead. It could be just the thing. Or if you're staying home this month, a perfect way to have a little micro vacation is to go and spend a few hours at a large garden near you or a garden center. Sometimes even a cemetery has plantings of flowers or graves that are decorated with flowers. So think about that. But I want us to have this feeling of summer's here, of rest and vacation. And I think garden can be an important component to that. Don't forget to sit and think a little bit about your own garden memories. I'm sure there's some that loom in your mind if you spend some time and think about it. I know for me, one or two of my earliest memories is of picking stones in what seemed to be my parents' enormous vegetable garden in rural Vermont. That's where you had to pick stones like potatoes in buckets, bucket after bucket. The soil is so rocky there. And then, of course, a magical place for me were the gardens in Uganda, East Africa, where everything tropical grew and the climate was perfect. Things grew so fast. You could just break a stick or a little twig off of a plant or a tree, stick it in the dirt, and before you knew it, it had rooted, sprouted, and was growing into its own plant. Magical gardening, really. And then I think about that rose garden I visited once in a walled garden in the north of England, where I could smell the roses hundreds of yards before I actually entered the walled garden. That truly was magical. So think about gardens in your own memory, in your own history this month. Write those in your journal too. In preparing for this month's topic, I thought a lot about my current garden too. And I guess I came to this realization that I think I could be even more content and charmed by my very cookie cutter suburban American home if I expanded the gardens a little bit, which seems like a lot of work, but honestly, it can be somewhat easy to expand your garden rather than to try to move into a different house altogether. So that's kind of in my mind, and I'm thinking as I look through and read some of the books on our book list this month, I'm going to get some ideas. How could I add to my garden and kind of turn it more and more into a sanctuary and help myself become even more contented with my small suburban backyard? And I do have a lot of books for us this month. That's intentional because I want to give you so many ideas and options. You'll be attracted to certain books and others to different ones. So I've got lots of things for you to look at. I've got coffee table books and memoirs and children's books and gardening books that go along with a lot of the people that we've studied over the years. So enjoy that video. Be sure to leave in the comments any particular gardening books that you might like, because there is no way I could even scratch a dent into all of the gardening books that are available out there. So what about the history of gardening? It's a history that is as old as the history of the human race. First, of course, gardening would have developed because of the need for food. So it was sort of agricultural in purpose. And then later, the ornamental and growing for pleasure and beauty followed that. Of course, in the Christian and Jewish tradition, the beginning of the human race actually took place in a garden. And so in that history, we have gardens from the very beginning of time. In other historical records from 4,000 years ago in Egypt, there are records of gardens there. And then, of course, we have mention of the hanging gardens of Babylon, which are so elusive because we've never actually found physical evidence of them, and yet we all want to know what they look like. And then, of course, there were gardens during the Greek culture and then during Roman times. Wouldn't it have been fun to take a tour of some of those ancient gardens? And then coming on through into medieval times, gardens were carried on often by the monks in the monasteries, as they spent most of their time working in agricultural type of jobs. And they would, of course, grown much of their own food, all of their own food in their kitchen gardens, but then also have had time to put in some ornamental flowers as well. An interesting thing to think about with gardens and the history of gardening is that growing vegetables and herbs really was of necessity for everyone in every class and level of society. But for many centuries, many millennia actually, it was only for the wealthy that flower and ornamental gardens could be grown for their enjoyment. Because you think about land that had to be taken away from agricultural use and put to just floral use, and then the money that it would cost to pay the gardeners to keep those gardens up. And of course, eventually, as we come into modern times, the flowers become more and more accessible to the lower classes, to the working classes. Still, there's always that need for growing food, but we can see in the art and the writings of, say, Georgian England, Victorian England, that flowers kind of creep their way into those cottage gardens. We have to mention Thoreau, of course, and we know how much he loved the woods and nature. But I kind of wonder how much he truly enjoyed cultivated plants. He did have to cultivate his own food, especially that year when he was staying at Walden Pond. We know he grew his bean plot. I have a quote here in which he says, "Gardening is civil and social, but it wants the vigor and freedoms of the forest and the outlaw." I think that he really preferred to leave growing to nature and to enjoy the wild side of plants and trees. There are so many things to ponder when we talk about the subject of a garden. And I wanted to read you a beautiful quote from Christy Purifoy's book, A Home in Bloom, which is going to be, of course, on the book list. Listen to what she says. "Gardens are much more than backdrops. They are much more than pretty pictures. Gardens are where our food comes from. Gardens are where beauty grows. Gardens are shelter. Gardens are also sacred spaces for private prayer and community celebration. Gardens are where we walk with God and work our muscles. They are living works of art. What if you could live in a painting? What if you could stroll through a song? What if you entered a chapel or even a cathedral every time you went out to fetch the mail?" And then she continued in another place, "If tending a garden is one way of re-enchanting our homes and bringing them to life, then we are like magicians. It is magic to add a vase of daffodils to the breakfast table and completely alter the mood of the morning." I love that. And if we are gardening, if we are tending a little pot inside, a little houseplant, or flower gardens outside, think of yourself as a magician of bringing beauty and imagination and magic to the surroundings that are around you, to the people that are in your life. All right, I want to go over our ideas for this month. We have the July Sit Spot prompts, and this is a little bit of sort of some thoughts about gardens. Describe or list some of the first gardens in your memory. What garden plants or elements of a garden most appeal to you? Describe garden elements at this sit spot or elements you would like to have. And what brings the most joy to you right now at this sit spot? And then some of the ideas include researching famous gardens or famous gardeners, or the history of gardening, or gardening in a specific culture. You know, every culture has their own way. Think about the Japanese gardens or Chinese gardens, or what might grow in a South American garden. I've mentioned African gardens and their tropical plants. There's just so much variety. Even here in the United States, if you could imagine, wouldn't it be fun if we could post a picture from a garden from every one of us here in the creative? All over the United States, it would look so different because of our climates. And then we're going to do a few things with our paints. I've got one tutorial that's longer, and it is focused on painting a complicated garden scene, trying to figure out how to do that, how best to sort of simplify and capture the whole feeling. This is a garden that I was at a week ago. And then there is a tutorial for doing some quick and easy garden elements in a much shorter time frame, just adding some elements to your sketchbook. You'll find those in there. And then, as always, I would encourage you to keep painting in your own pages things that you're seeing. And I'm loving keeping this little sketchbook with me. So much easier to just have a tiny little space to try to get something down. I'm hoping that you can plan to visit a garden this month somewhere, sometime, or take a walk around your neighborhood, look at your neighbors' plants. Maybe go into town if you live near a city, walk some of the city streets. Their plantings are usually different and more concentrated. That can be really fun. And then, of course, don't forget to check out the book list and see what books you might want to be reading. In fact, during that video, I am going to share which of those books I've picked to bring on my own week of vacation this month. Well, I hope that you have a wonderful July and that the subject of gardens brings you a lot of joy and refreshment, just some sort of washing of the brain with beauty and preparing it for the rest of the summer, for whatever the fall may bring. But let's take this time to really soak ourselves in the joy of gardens.